Diving into the draft mailbag to tell you about some edge rushers we have yet to discuss. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Friday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. I am the deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. And one of the ways that you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You can get news, rumors, updates, just general thoughts, plus one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Some of my favorite late round players and off-season dates have been announced for the Buccaneers. That is all coming up in a little bit. Quick shout out to Lethal Trip, who said that he is joining live listening on the way home from work. Yes, listen, don't watch while you are driving home from work. I don't want your YouTube, name to become a premonition. So please enjoy listening, but keep your eyes on the road. I would very much appreciate that. We got Ballard Sports Media in the chat. We got Stu J in the chat, Joe Parnan. Appreciate all of you jumping in already. But we are starting off this live episode with an insider mailbag draft edition. That's right. The NFL draft is less than a month away, and we're going to be talking about it a lot over the coming weeks in preparation of the Bucs and the rest of the NFL looking for their next crop of hopeful stars to lead their team for the next decade or so they hope. And I've done a lot of talking on the show about guys like Jared Verse and Chop Robinson as potential targets for the Buccaneers in the first round. And I think that they should be. I think those guys should be the top two for the Bucs on their draft board without question. But as I've said on this show before, I talked about it with Evan on Wednesday, the draft is unpredictable. And you may not have the opportunity to take those guys in the first round. And last week I talked about positions that I would target if the Bucs don't have any edge rush options at pick 26, which is fine, but I didn't really offer up any alternatives, did I? So, that inspired insider David to submit this to the mailbag, and he said, who are some edge rushers you'd want to see the Bucs target if they don't get one in the first round? Well, in a perfect world, my target for the Bucs would be a trade with the Philadelphia Eagles for Hassan Reddick, but that doesn't actually answer David's question. So, who are some day two candidates that I think could come in and make an impact? And remember, Yaya Diaby was a day two pick. Antoine Winfield Jr., Chris Godwin, Ali Marpet, Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean, Mike Edwards, all of these guys were day two picks for Jason Light and the Buccaneers. So they have found serious contributors on day two in the draft over the last couple of years. So this isn't me just blowing smoke and saying, oh yeah, these guys could come in and contribute. No, these guys could legitimately come in and contribute as day two edge rushers. So first, I really like Chris Braswell out of Alabama, and he doesn't get the publicity or the attention as his teammate Dallas Turner, but he's a really solid prospect. 6'5", 255, had 13 sacks last season for the Crimson Tide, and he has an athletic profile that is absolutely off the charts. He's got power. He ran a 4.6 40 with a 1.59 split, which is absolutely outstanding for a guy that size, and he could really shine in Todd Bowles' defense. In fact, Pro Football Focus actually has Braswell rated higher than both Chop Robinson and Darius Robinson. And while I personally disagree, it shows that this is a player that they view as being even better than two of the edge rushers that I like for the Bucs in the first round and that we have seen consistently mocked in the first round. So this guy is probably a borderline first round pick, and I'm not sure that he slips all the way to the Buccaneers at 56 in the second round. But if the Buccaneers don't like their options at 26 and they decide to slide down maybe to the beginning of the second round and add a little extra draft capital in the process, he could be a really, really good option for them. Now, I'm also a big fan of Marshawn Nealon out of Western Michigan. This is a guy that might actually fall to the Bucs' second round pick. He's 6'3", 275, and relies really heavily on his strength to bully opposing offensive linemen at the point of attack and really impose his will on whoever he's going up against. He's got that nasty in him that I've talked about on this podcast that we like to see in pass rushers, but we also like to see in offensive linemen. He's not super fast. He ran a 4.75, but his 10-yard split was 1.66. So that's only 0.05 slower than Braswell, who I just talked about. And it's a little more important when you're taking a look at these edge rushers, when you're looking at defensive linemen, when you look at their 40 times, their 10-yard split is actually a little bit more important than what that 40 time is, because you're looking for that really good initial burst. If your edge rushers are running 40 yards, then the play has gone horribly wrong anyway, and that's not really the time you need to focus on. The time you need to focus on is that 10-yard split to see what their get-off is, how quickly they can get into the backfield and disrupt the opposing quarterback. So Nealon had just 6 sacks in 10 games last season, finished with 12 sacks over the course of his time with Western Michigan. He's a little raw, but the talent is there, and he can for sure succeed at the NFL level. He needs a little work with pass rush moves because the strength and skill of offensive linemen at the NFL are going to be a lot harder for him to overpower and bully than the guys that he faced at Bowling Green or Ohio University or Northern Illinois or Miami of Ohio. But this is a guy that I really like if the Bucs are going to stand pat in the second round for a potential edge rusher to fall to them. Again, athletic profile is off the charts. I really like that. Little raw. You would hope that Todd Bowles and the rest of the defensive coaching staff can really coach him up. Yaya Diaby was raw, and he really started to emerge towards the back half of last season. So kind of a similar situation. I don't think he would have quite the immediate impact as Braswell, but he's still a really good option in the second round that can be a starter for the Buccaneers next year. And then finally, Jonah Ellis out of Utah. He is very, very young, only 20 years old, but he has an incredibly high ceiling. So he's a little bit smaller, 6'2", 250 pounds, but he has an endless reserve of energy. This is one of those players that when you're watching the NFL draft, whether you're watching on ESPN or NFL Network or wherever you're getting your coverage, this is one of those players that the pundits and the talking heads on those programs are going to say he's got a high motor. And what they mean by that is that he's constantly going. I may end up nicknaming him the Energizer Bunny because he just keeps going and going and going and is relentless and utilizes that speed and that quickness rather than strength because he is a little bit on the smaller side. But undersized players aren't something new for Todd Bowles, and he tends to get the best out of those kinds of players more often than not. One of the big knocks is his size. And a lot of the draft experts talk about him needing to add some muscle. But the problem with adding that muscle, while you want to add that strength, it could hurt his speed and his quickness in the process, which is his number one attribute. So Mock Draft Database, which is a place that I really like to go. If you've never checked them out, what they do is they take mock drafts from all over the place. Pro Football Talk, Pro Football Focus, The Athletic, ESPN. They take all of these mock drafts that are all over the place, and they basically put them into a machine and average out where players are going to try to figure out who is being mocked to where most often. And Mock Draft Database has the Bucs as the second team that he is most often mocked to at 10% of total mock drafts, trailing only the Detroit Lions. So this is a guy that a lot of people are pointing to, saying, you know what, in the second round, this could be a seriously viable option for the Buccaneers to address their edge rushing need. So those are a couple of the day 2 edge rushers. And of course, I leaned more towards the second round than I did the third round, but a couple of other names for you guys to think about as we continue this process. I am going to jump into a chat coming up in a little bit, but what about my favorite day 3 players? That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, over-unders. You can even pick who's going to win it all. We are down to 12 teams with the rest of the Sweet 16 happening tonight. UConn is still the favorite at plus 120, followed by Houston and Purdue at plus 600 each, Tennessee at plus 1100, and yes, my Illinois Fighting Illini, now the 5th best odds at plus 1,400 to win the national championship after knocking out Iowa State on Thursday night. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every single day. Going to jump into the chat really quick. Corey, I appreciate you, my friend. You are a man of your word. You are a good sport. Corey in the chat says, guess I'm an Illinois fan now. Congrats on the win. I appreciate you, buddy. I'm a little sorry about the ad read that just happened to remind you of that, but you know I'm excited, and hopefully they can keep it going and knock off UConn, and you all can make sure that you're not reminding Evan Klosky on Twitter at eKloskyWTSP about the blasphemous things that he said about Illinois before the tournament even started. Did see somebody else in the Stu J in the chat says, if we secure edge first round, what is the likelihood of securing a starting O-line in the second round? Well, Stu, I got some good news for you. Well, good news, bad news. The good news is I'm going to tell you about some potential offensive linemen that are that could be sitting there in the second round of the draft for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but that is coming up on Monday's episode, so you're going to want to make sure to come back. Lots of draft talk coming up over the course of the next few weeks. We are going to continue to dive into a lot of different players, a lot of different positions, and one of the things that I love to do over at BucsNation.com is we do a prospect profile series, basically 30 players in 30 days leading up to the draft. And I like to send out these assignments to the writing staff of players that range from the first round to the 7th round to give everybody kind of a broad range, so we're not hyper-focused on those day 1, day 2 guys, and you start to become familiar with some of the day 3 guys. But Meanwhile, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're going to stay in the draft mailbag, and insider TJ asked, obviously, once we get to day 3, teams are looking for a diamond in the rough or a depth or rotational player. Who are some of the guys you like that the Buccaneers could get starting in round 4? So that's a really good question. I've talked about a couple, but not a lot. So I do have a list of a couple of guys that I really, really like. And obviously, the guy that I've talked about the most is Audric Estime, the running back out of Notre Dame, who could be there with the Buccaneers' 4th-round pick, although he did boost his stock at the Notre Dame Pro Day by improving his 40 time. That was one of the big knocks against him coming out of the scouting combine. I just love his combination of power and football speed, and the fact that he caught every target thrown his way when he played for the Fighting Irish. So he adds a little something different than the Bucs get in Rachaad White or Chase Edmonds, and I think he would add another level to the offense. So again, he's my favorite running back for the Buccaneers in the upcoming draft based on, he's not the top guy. Yes, I do think there are running backs in the draft that are better than him, but I think he is the best fit for what Tampa Bay needs out of their running backs. But another guy that I like a lot, though he's kind of hovering in that projected area where the Bucs don't have a draft pick, is Auburn safety Jalen Williams. So Williams is one of the best cover safeties in the draft, but he lacks a lot when it comes to run defense. That's the big knock on him. However, in Bowles' scheme, he's the guy that could come in and play that center field role and just worry about being in coverage. His closing speed is unreal. And, when you sit down to watch him, he wins his share of those 50-50 passes against top-level receivers. One of the best games that he had last season was against LSU, and we're talking about a quarterback and at least one, maybe two wide receivers that are going to go in the 1st round, and he absolutely balled out. We also know that Jason Light loves his secondary guys out of Auburn, and Williams could be an immediate special teams guy with his speed, but then have the time to develop, be a rotational player, be some depth, God forbid, if Winfield or Whitehead go down. But they're going to need those new special teams contributors, especially with the new kickoff rules. A really, really late guy that I like and I've had my eye on for a little while, and you can call me biased if you want to. It's completely fine, but stay with me here. Illinois wide receiver Casey Washington. Okay, so he's 6'2", 200 pounds, sub 4.5 speed. He had 49 receptions for 670 yards and 4 touchdowns last year for the Fighting Illini, who, unlike the year before, were absolutely terrible at football. So those numbers are even more impressive considering the competition they went up against and how bad the team was. But this is a player that can immediately compete for that wide receiver 3 position because he offers size that Trey Palmer and Devin Tompkins don't have. He's not quite as fast. He's still very fast, but he's not quite as fast as Palmer or Tompkins. But the size is what I am looking at. Another big target for Baker Mayfield. He also has the ability to compete for the return specialist position or offer an alternative if Tompkins isn't getting the Bucs the spark that they need in the return game. Again, we're talking about a late round pick, probably pick 220 in the 6th round would be kind of the ceiling for Casey Washington, right around that range. When you're looking for depth, competition, special teams, someone with upside, Washington fits the bill if the Bucs are going to wait on receiver and are looking for that diamond in the rough. Finally, a little bit of a wild card because this is a position I talked about a little bit, but it's not a glaring need. But I really, really like Florida State tight end Jaheim Bell. another big target, 6'3", 240. He's coming off of a 500-yard season with a pair of touchdowns, caught 39 of 52 targets last year, and is a decent run blocker, but has room to improve there. And yes, I know the Buccaneers just drafted Payne Durham last year, but O'Keefe is not a pass-catching tight end, and the Bucs are going to need another option there to go along with Durham and Cade Otton. They probably would have the youngest tight end room in the NFL if they opted to draft another tight end instead of signing a cheap veteran free agent after the draft is over. But Bell is such an interesting prospect. He never could replicate the success that he had as a freshman when he was averaging over 16 yards per reception and finished with 5 touchdowns. But he is a viable pass catching threat. He is another big red zone target when the Bucs get down there, especially if they are going to run multiple tight end sets to try to disguise. They're going to line up looking like they're going to run inside the 5-yard line. Nice little play action boot by Mayfield. And then you would have Bell there in the end zone, who's going to be a mismatch against most linebackers and just about any safety in the NFL there in that red zone area. He could be a sneaky good pick on day 3 of the NFL draft. I want to jump into the chat again one more time. Corey in the chat says, any thoughts on Ray Davis, the Kentucky running back? Obviously, he has the Liam Cohen connection. I have not really looked into Davis at all yet. I've heard the name floated out there just because of the connection with Cohen. But when I sit down to do some more research into the draft, I'm kind of chipping my way along here. So he's not a guy that I have really watched a lot or read a lot about. So I don't want to give an opinion that I'm going to then turn around and take back, but he is a guy that is on my list of prospects to dive into and really start to look at, because it's a position of need for the Buccaneers, because there is that connection to Liam Cohen. But I've heard a lot of really good things about Davis. I just haven't formulated an opinion on him myself at this point in time. Let's see. We have Divis Druid says size. How about 6'7"? I know I looked. I don't think he's a day 3 pick. And of course, Druid is referring to wide receiver out of Florida State, whose name now escapes me. Yes, very big target. And his draft stock has kind of slipped. He started out being projected as a late first-round pick, and he's kind of slid down to, the ceiling being the mid-second round, into the beginning of the 3rd round. So he didn't meet the qualifications that I had when I was talking about Casey Washington, because he won't be there on day 3. But that would certainly, if the Bucs look for wide receiver earlier than day 3, he's definitely one that I have had my eye on. The offseason dates have been announced for the Buccaneers. That is coming up next on Locked On Bucs. Wrapping things up here on a Friday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast. And the Buccaneers have announced their off-season workout dates coming up, and they are as follows. The first day is April 15th, just 10 days before the draft, with OTAs beginning on May 21st. And those go from May 21st to 23rd, then the 28th through the 30th, and then June 4th through the 6th. Then mandatory minicamp begins June 11th through June 13th. Now, for those that don't know, there is no contact during any of these. And rookie minicamp is not included in these dates. But this will be the beginning of strength and conditioning, walkthrough style practices, but they are not allowed to conduct offense versus defense. So the offensive players are going to practice with the offensive players. The defensive players are going to practice with the defensive players. They cannot mix with one another. You cannot do 7-on-7s. You cannot do 11-on-11s. You can't do any of that stuff. The offense and defense have to be kept completely separate. So what you'll begin to see here, at least in the Buccaneers case, is Liam Cohen beginning to have the offense get up to speed with the new scheme. They're going to work on it in meetings and film sessions and the classroom sessions, but this is when the players will be able to put it into action as they begin to install things. They're in, especially installing the verbiage. All the verbiage is going to be different compared to what it was last year. And of course, outside of June 11th through 13th, which is the mandatory minicamp, all of these other dates are voluntary. It'll also help the coaching staff and Jason Light assess any potential missing pieces that Light and Bowles need to work on finding and bringing in, either to compete for roster spots or at the very least kind of fill out their training camp roster, which is going to be 90 players. And there's no date yet for the start of training camp. Last year, it was at the very end of July. So it's going to be right around the very end of July, the very beginning of August, somewhere in that range. So, they're not going to have all of those players probably locked and loaded when these camps begin. You have the draft process. You have undrafted free agency. You have the second wave of free agency for the Bucs to fill out these rosters and get up to 90 players. I don't think the Bucs are going to be missing many, if any, players, but you never really know. Again, they're voluntary, but generally the Buccaneers have really good turnout at these OTAs in terms of, players attending and showing up voluntarily. And then, of course, they get one more big break before the start of training camp. But I'm also wondering if this might be a time when conversations will ramp up between Jason Light and Tristan Wirfs and or Antoine Winfield Jr. Obviously, they don't have to be in person for these negotiations. These things go through the agents anyway. But deadlines breed results, right? And if either or both of these deals are not done by the time these OTAs begin, the clock is going to begin to tick a little bit, especially with Winfield's deal that actually does have a true deadline to extend because he's on the franchise tag. But I'm wondering if that's really when we're going to see that ramp up, when Jason is seeing Tristan and seeing Antoine in the building on a day-to-day basis. And, those conversations that I'm sure have already had preliminary stages. There have already been kind of the starts of both sides working on it. But that might be when we really start to see this speed up a little bit and really start to hammer out some true details to get those extensions done. Going to jump into the chat one more time before we get out of here. We have Stu J in the chat says, well, it would be a great opportunity for the offense to work with the new offensive coordinator. It absolutely will. And that's why I think you're probably going to get about 99% of the players reporting for these voluntary dates, because especially on the offensive side of the ball, because they are going to want to start to really get to work with Liam Cohen and start to get this offense down. Now, of course, we've heard that it's very similar to what Dave Canales did last year. There are going to be some changes, some tweaks, some preferences that Liam Cohen likes to lean on because every coach is different. But, Baker already pretty much understands what the offense is. You have John Wolford, who's there, who has been in the offense. Then it's about getting all the other guys up to speed. And this is really when they get their first taste of that. And I think a lot of these players are excited to get back out there with Baker, with the new offensive coordinator, to try to build off of especially the late season success that they all had last year. So I do expect a really solid turnout for the Bucs and their offense at these voluntary workouts. I also do not expect there to be a Devin White level issue like there was last year with the Instagram posts and the not showing up and the trade demands and all that nonsense. I don't really foresee any kind of drama like that happening with any of the players on the roster. I could be wrong. It wouldn't be the first time, won't be the last time. My wife tells me all the time how wrong I am in every aspect of everything. But I think that this is a pretty solid and cohesive unit that's excited to get to work together. Let's see. We have Joe Parnan saying, why don't you like Braylon Trice, if not Robinson, Latu, or Verse? I don't dislike Braylon Trice at all. Just not a guy that I've really talked about a lot on this show. I mean, I have my personal preferences, but I've been basing my preferences on who I think will go in the first round and who will still be there when the Bucs pick at 26. That's why I haven't talked about Dallas Turner. That's why I really haven't talked about Latu a whole lot, because I do think he's going to be the second edge rusher off the board, and it's going to be somewhere in the teens before the Bucs get the opportunity to pick. And even Jared Verse is borderline going to be there. I think Verse, if the Bucs are going to draft him, it's going to require a move up to potentially the early 20s. I think you have to get ahead of the Miami Dolphins if you want Jared Verse, depending on how the rest of the board falls, which is why I've kind of gravitated towards Chop Robinson, because I do like him better than Darius Robinson. But I mean, again, I don't have any problems with Braylon Trice. I just don't think that he's going to go in the first round. So that's really why I haven't talked about him much, but going to be diving into a lot more of these prospects. And again, Druid, your question in the chat about, I think it was you, about finding a star, or no, it was Stu J. I apologize. I'll throw it up on the screen again. You know, if we secure edge in the first round, what is the likelihood of securing starting offensive line in the second round? I'm going to have an answer for you coming up on Monday's episode. But that is going to do it for this episode of Locked On Bucs. Again, thank you to all who joined in the chat. Hitting my microphone. Really appreciate all of you jumping in and being a part of the show. I appreciate each and every one of you so much. In the meantime, please check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Like I said, we're doing 30 prospects in 30 days, profiling these players, spanning from the first round all the way to the seventh round, to get you familiar with some of the prospects at positions of need for the Buccaneers. So check that out every single day leading up to the NFL draft. Follow along on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @Yarcho_Bucs. Become an insider at joinsubtext.com/Locked On Bucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. Want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.